Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? We have the real honor and pleasure to be with Dr. Hanna Kassab, who's at East Carolina University. He's a leading expert on international relations and security. He's an associate professor in political science and security studies at East Carolina. He's written, 20 books, published extensively on books, all different topics related to international relations theory, deterrence, threat prioritization. He's written a litany of academic articles as well and teaches a lot of courses throughout his career, but primarily really specializing in international politics and security. He did his PhD at the University of Miami and has been in academia ever since. Wonderful colleague, wonderful person, and never dull. So thank you so much, Dr. Kassab, for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So my first question is for everyone is, out of all things, how did you become interested in these topics? Why international relations, international security?
I was always interested in war, and specifically one day I remember that I was with my dad and we were watching the news, and there was something on the Cold War. I asked him, "What's the Cold War? Why is it cold?" And he said that's when two countries, other than the main parties, are fighting a war on behalf of a third party. And I thought to myself, why would anybody do that? And just being a very inquisitive person, I would be just looking at history museums and documentaries, and I would just get very interested. And one day I was applying for school, and I took my first international relations course, and I thought to myself, I think this is it. This is it for me. And I just enjoyed these big ideas of Francis Fukuyama and Samuel Huntington. And I said, this is it. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. I want to talk about these topics.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. So, can you talk to us a little about what is international relations theory? What's the goal of IR theory? Is it to explain? Is it to predict? And why do we use theories in international security?
Yeah. Well, theories are important because, well, first of all, they're a set of assumptions that we use to understand something that's been going on, like war. So, why do countries go to war? And one of my favorite theories, structural realism, and I'm partial primarily to the offensive realist theory that argues that states go to war because of the first assumption, anarchy. There's no world police, there's no world power that allows us to solve our problems. So you have to use power to protect yourself. And oftentimes, these struggles for power, especially when it comes to the relativity of the international system and international politics, that war often happens. So we assume that one states reside in a structure of anarchy. They seek security through power, conflicts over interests, which then feed into power. And these mechanisms are defined by relative gains. So if we look at what's going on with the in the Gulf right now between Iran, the Arab states, Israel, and the United States, the question of who's in control over the Straits of Hormuz, that's a relative gains problem. So Iran shut off the Straits of Hormuz to deny states oil. Now the question is, who is hurt more? So Iran is seeking to survive, so it closes down the Straits of Hormuz to discourage parties from continuing to attack it. But that kind of plays into the United States because it cuts Iran off from actually selling its oil to China. So China loses out, Iran loses out, and the United States, because it is the largest producer of oil, enjoys higher oil prices. So they're winners and losers. But the primary thing that we have to understand is that because of anarchy, states are engaged in a war naturally to survive. And sometimes this takes place in within the parameters of relative gains.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you've done a lot of research on grand strategy. What are the core tenets for you when you study grand strategy?
Well, the grand strategy is an overall framework of how a state, any state, whether great or weak, how they seek to survive. And so they will look at their situation, what are the main threats to their survival, and they will come up with a strategy that will assist in their survival as independent political units on the international stage. So for the United States, their grand strategy should be one of primacy, because they are a hegemon, and they're, well, right now, I believe that we're in a period of multipolarity, but because multipolarity is a competition between not just two, but many states, that the grand strategy of the United States should be to return to hegemony. And so that's, I believe, what we're seeing on the international system. So, because of the threats of multipolarity, with other states gaining, the United States must then go on the offensive to destabilize and correct course. And so, what does that mean? That means forcing NATO states to increase their military spending so they can deal with Russia. So through American leadership, and NATO can check Russia. That means developing ties with Taiwan and Japan to balance against um, an ever expanding China. And of course, with what we're seeing now, dealing with Iran and serving to ensure that China does not get the oil resources necessary to continue to grow. 40% of oil that China needs goes through the Straits of Hormuz, and 90% of Iranian oil is sold to China. So, this situation right now, uh, one can argue that it's Trump is launching this war not simply to correct or stop Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, but it is to target China. So once China is dealt with, possibly it faces an economic crisis that leads to the collapse of its system that will have spillover effects to Russia, thereby ushering in a new period of American primacy and hegemony.
So you talked about realism. Some realist scholars and some very famous ones like John Mearsheimer, Kenneth Walsh, Robert Jervis, among others, focus a lot on hard power. What actually is hard power? How does the state acquire it? And how is that different from maybe economic or soft power, the coin termed by the late great Joseph Nye?
Hard power is military power primarily. It's the ability to encourage or coerce other countries to adjust their behavior in a way that matches your own. It's the reason why Belarus refrains from going too far in its relationship with NATO and the United States. It's the reason why many in surrounding China in the former in Central Asia, the Central Asian republics, why they also are considering balancing their relationships with other countries, and why the United States is able to exert such influence in Latin America, such as what happened in Venezuela and in Cuba with the blockade that we're seeing. Venezuela cannot get its oil resources to Cuba. And so that, because of the American Navy that's stationed there, and of course, what we're seeing in the Gulf, as I said before, when dealing with Iran. So hard power, military power, is the final, it's the arbiter of American politics, or excuse me, international politics. If there is something to be done, then hard power is used to get it done. It's also the reason why Russia invaded Ukraine. In the mind of Russia, in the mind of the main,
Putin,
yeah, the main
Vladimir
character
Putin.
over there, uh, that Ukraine is moving too close to NATO, and so there was nothing except an invasion, apparently, that needed to be done. And so that is why according to John Mearsheimer and other realists, that the invasion of Ukraine happened. So hard power is military power, and economic power is the use of one's economic size, its purchasing power, its market size, its economic size to encourage or allow for certain outcomes. So if a country can use a carrot and stick approach when it comes to economic power, it can offer trade deals, it can provide aid packages so that states have uh, or acquiesce to the demands of the more powerful state. And if that fails, then sanctions could be exerted or tariffs can be exerted. I think President Trump uses tariffs to ensure specific outcomes. For instance, to encourage other countries to buy American goods, to invest in the United States, and this is part of economic power. Military power is bought by economic power. So economic power is directly tied to military power. The richer you get, the more wealthier a country becomes, the more likely it has interest to defend abroad, and the more likely it has to increase its military power. This is the Fareed Zakaria perspective. So it's very important, economic power as a tool that would first encourage and then coerce a state to operate in a very particular way. And soft power is about leadership, it's about charisma, it's about getting states to follow you because you are you. It's the United States. When there is a problem in the international system, the United States is called upon because it is seen as the world leader, the world police, it's a very important state that can get things done, and so a lot of countries rely on American leadership. And such soft power, not many countries enjoy that. It's what makes America or the United States an exceptional power. That not many countries can have that sort of leadership capability.
Yeah, really, really interesting. So you mentioned this kind of core tenet of anarchy and this self-help world that there's no kind of 911 for the realist proposition. You know, a lot of individuals said, well, after the Cold War, was realism did it fail to predict, right? Did it fail to explain that? And some hardcore realists would say the system didn't really change. Can you talk a little bit about this notion of anarchy? And other scholars would say, people like John Eikenberry and kind of a liberalism tenant or liberal tenant we talk about the role of institutions, international law, cooperation. How do realist scholars view this notion of the international system and anarchy?
Yes, there with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many thought that realism failed to predict. But I mean, states rise and fall. You know, that's the Paul Kennedy argument. Sometimes states collapse under imperial overstretch. This is a natural part of the international system. So when the Soviet Union fell, we had a very weakened Russia, and the United States expanded its influence. Um, in an offensive realist capacity, one can clearly see that the United States took advantage of Russian weakness to increase NATO membership in a way that estranged Russia. And I think that's what led us to the situation we have today. So anarchy still existed even though the United States was the world hegemon. There were still wars that occurred, especially within states, civil wars. There were wars that continue to have a very large impact. The Georgian War, for instance, in 2008, and then the Crimea War in 2014. These were all major signposts. And also, we had the rise of China during the 90s. A lot of people don't understand or realize that the mistakes that the United States made in the 90s allowed for the rise of China, joining the WTO, investing in a communist country, all these endangered the United States. It allowed for the rise of the multipolar world, the absolute rise of China. And so I think a lot of scholars tend to give too much emphasis on this like liberal institutionalist idea where countries are going to work through established institutions that the United States set up, the Bretton Woods system, and everything will be honky-dory. However, that was just not the case. The opposite happened. The United States did not allow for more representation, Chinese representation in the IMF. So what did China do? It created its own institution, the AIIB, and the New Development Bank. These are Chinese institutions that compete directly with the United States Bretton Woods institutions. And so, states create these institutions only for themselves, for their self-interest, and to perpetuate their power. And as we have seen that these systems, these institutions become very static. And I think this is why President Trump has pulled out of a lot of these institutions, like the World Health Forum, the World Health Organization, excuse me, and other the World Trade Organization unilaterally imposing tariffs across the board last year. So these are very important things that we have to understand. States are the primary actors. These institutions are simply their babies.
Yeah, so it's interesting, scholars like John Mearsheimer would talk about, you mentioned that we lived in a multipolar world. They would date it really to kind of the US hegemony or unipolar moment ending in 2017. Can you talk about kind of the current state of the international system and the multipolar world, maybe thinking about great powers such as, rivalry and competition between, the United States, China, and Russia? And then how do you see the rise of other countries? The famous goal term, the BRICS, that was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs economists, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. How do you evaluate the current system? Is it multipolar? How did the rise and of other countries impact this international system today?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union created a sense of great insecurity in Russia. And this led to the development of the Primakov Doctrine, which argued that close relations between Russia and China are needed in order to return the system to a bipolar or multipolar system. So, through close coordination with China, Russia can then again be a great power. So this was a design back in the 90s. So you had the sort of conceptualization of a multipolar drive through close coordination with countries that don't appreciate American hegemony. And so this is why we see the rise of the BRICS, uh, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and to the lesser extent, South Africa. And with the BRICS expansion, including Iran, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and so on. These countries are seeking to not just side on one side, because there's clearly those countries like Russia and China who want to destroy American hegemony, but there's other countries like India that are playing their own game, their own rise to power, regardless of their internal development issues. Indonesia is the same way, it seems. So the idea for BRICS is to return to multipolarity. And the rise idea of the BRICS dollar, the alternative to the US dollar as a world reserve currency, is a clear and present danger to the hegemony of the United States. That being said, the BRICS alliance, which I think we can call it an alliance, because these countries are actively conducting military exercises together under the BRICS name. But this doesn't mean that an alliance that can last, especially if you look at the conflicts between India and China. There was a war in 2020 in the Ladakh region of India and China, where they came to physical blows. And so the United States would be wise to encourage India to break away once and for all from Russia and China, but that presents its own challenges because India uses Russian military hardware, and that's very difficult to, I assume it's very difficult to retrain soldiers to use another set of hardware. but this is something I think is very important that the United States attempts to do. And I think it goes back to this idea of exceptional powers, civilizational states a la Samuel Huntington. It's the Huntington argument regarding the clash of civilizations. This was seen as a very racist argument, and I never agreed with that. I always saw it as a very, I think, convincing argument where countries want to be recognized for their historical importance. Turkey wants to be recognized for their exceptionalism, as does India. And I think the United States needs to understand that and play into that in order to break the BRICS alliance, this great threat to the United States. The dollar, again, a clear the BRICS competing BRICS dollar is a clear and present danger to the United States. It's very important that the United States preserves its hegemony through maintaining the dollar as the world reserve currency.
Fascinating. I mean, we could spend future debates on the Huntington argument, which was extremely controversial and led to, intense debates about his work and that argument in general. But for time purposes, kind of shifting to talk a little bit about these realist doctrines that you've been discussing. Can you talk to us a little bit about mutually assured destruction and nuclear deterrence today?
Sure. Nuclear deterrence or mutually assured destruction is the idea of convincing your enemy that it's too expensive to attack. If an attack was to take place, then there would be reprisals that would deal out a similar or even greater damage. And so it convinces the enemy not to attack. This has been the foundation of global peace and security since the Cold War, since the Soviet Union acquired nuclear capability. And it has allowed states like India and Pakistan to solve their conflicts quickly rather than engage in a prolonged bloody conflict. Because the risk of escalation, going from small arms skirmish to full-scale warfare to nuclear exchange, is so dangerous that it forces states to the table to end the conflict before it gets to that point of nuclear exchange. So I credit nuclear weapons to be one of the reasons why the Cold War never went hot.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So pivoting, you've talked a lot about realism, but a lot of your work has also dealt with this notion of kind of securitization and how priorities shift over time. Can you talk a little bit about scholars like Barry Buzan and what's known as the Copenhagen School and this notion or this concept of securitization and how priorities change?
Right. This is a great question too. For the Copenhagen School, the brilliance behind it is that the realists tend to see military power as everything. But the problem with that is states can lose power based on non-military threats, like economic punishment or economic shocks, political shocks like internal instability, environmental shocks like pollution that degrade a state's human resources. We're seeing that in Mongolia and in India where children are becoming increasingly sick, and this threatens their life expectancy and their health, and that will definitely impact the state. So environmental problems should be securitized. We're going to get to what that means in a moment. Then we have health issues like COVID. COVID hit the entire world system very hard. And some of the problems that resulted from that, the quarantines, the shutdown, really fed into and degraded a lot of countries' power. It led to increased debt, and we might see debt crises emerging in the next 10 years or so. 5, 10 years. And so one of the things I love about the Copenhagen School is that it shows a relationship between referent objects, those objects to be secured, the economy, the environment, and it shows the impact on the levels of analysis, like the individual, the local governments, subsystems, the state, and then the regions and the systems. So I find it's a brilliant tool. And what I also love about it is the use of speech acts. So if a state feels like something is a existential threat, then they will use language to try to convince their population that that indeed is a threat, that it needs to be treated very quickly outside the scope of normal procedure into extreme procedure. And so the problem with, in today's terms, with organized crime in Mexico, in Venezuela, in other such countries, these are often treated in terms of normal politics. You get a warrant, you go through the court process, you arrest someone, and so on. Nowadays, the Trump administration has moved the organized crime into existential threat, and they've not coined, but adopted the term narco terrorist. And so by adopting that term terrorist with narcotics, narco terrorists, the government is allowed to adopt more extreme measures, which then explains why gun boats are being shot down in the Caribbean Sea. And I think because people understand the risks and the dangers associated with narcotics and the violence associated with organized crime. And so people accept it. So it's not just that the government uses a speech act, but the people, the audience, has to accept it as a fact, as the case, and accepts that um, normal procedures are no longer being adopted. And I think for me, while offensive realist is like a staple, my bread and butter, I really enjoy the Copenhagen School and using it to understand non-state threats.
Yeah, just to push back and play devil's advocate. I mean, I think that the rules of engagement in identifying some of these, criminal organizations as terrorists has led to an intense debate, right? What are their goals? What are their objectives, right? There are major differences in terms of organized crime. And then you've seen in terms of, you said that it has to be accepted, but, there is this element of there's intense debates about lethality, about international law, about the rules of engagement. But I think, to turn it back over to you, based on what you're saying is you have to kind of prioritize the security threat and the utilize speech acts, and then it's, if the threat is accepted, because a politician can promise anything, right? But if a threat is accepted, there's money and effort put behind that threat, right? And I guess piggybacking off of that, can you also talk about how maybe something can be desecuritized? One example we've seen a lot is, talking about the war on drugs, right? Perhaps, there should be more focus on, according to some scholars and experts, on treatment, rehabilitation, education, as opposed to just kind of the hard supply side approach. So you can talk about how these priorities can also change between administrations, and then can you move something down the securitization and quote unquote desecuritize it in terms of the agenda?
Absolutely. Across the board, I think the different administrations, the Biden administration, and then the second Trump administration, that sends a clear signal of a reprioritization. So during the Biden administration, climate change, the Green New Deal, all of these issues were front and center. You had major figures like Greta Thunberg and Bill Gates saying that drastic measures must be done in order to prevent the end of human civilization. And so we know instead of relying on fossil fuels, that we need to switch over to renewables, and it doesn't matter the cost. This just needs to get done. And so that was pretty much the whole emphasis of the Biden administration. When the Biden administration ended that, when it ended, then the Trump administration came in and ended those practices and then returned back to with an emphasis on fossil fuels. So climate change, the existential threat presented by the climate change, that sort of gotten reduced. Even Bill Gates came out earlier and said, I think we went too far in our language promoting climate change, and that might have done us a bit of a disservice to our credibility. And so the Trump administration now is prioritizing national security threats, like I mentioned, organized crime earlier, Iranian nuclear capability. He's also securitizing the border, ensuring that illegal immigration is contained or stopped. And he's also looking at Venezuela and Cuba and rolling back China from acquiring hegemonic status. And so all of these issues kind of tie in to this reprioritization, going from one administration to the next. So each administration is prioritizing something different. And I suspect if there's another Democratic administration that comes in after the Trump administration, that there's going to be a reemphasis on something completely different.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, pivoting on to some of your research on what you call weak states or fragile states, and you wrote your dissertation in your first book actually on this notion. Can you talk a little bit about weak states and international relations? What does this mean, a weak or fragile states? And how does your kind of research contribute to a lot of the classic research, which focuses on kind of quote unquote great power politics?
Mhm. So weak states are those states that are or have difficulty absorbing major international systemic shocks like economic crises. If there's a crisis in one country, it bleeds over very quickly to those states that are dependent on the more wealthier country. They are susceptible to political shocks, you know, through like political shocks like terrorism and organized crime. And oftentimes, like in Mexico, Mexico does not have complete sovereignty over its country. It is dealing with a very, some would say, a more powerful force of organized crime. And this presents a clear and present danger to the state itself. And so Mexico cannot deal with its organized crime problems in a way that is long-term beneficial. And I think we're seeing that play out now with the situation there, where the government, I think, had some difficulty. It's also an incredible, weak states are also incredibly corrupt in that they don't have, the government does not really have control over what it does. Sometimes they have to do the bidding of these organized criminal or these terrorist groups. Um, and sometimes they just simply act as proxies. But there are some states that are just have developmental problems, like the ones I explored in my dissertation and what became my first book. Developmental problems, and so they need to balance. Uh, they don't need to balance a bandwagon. They can just have positive relationships with both sides of the competing balance of power. You don't need to pick a side because you're so weak, you don't represent a threat. So you can do a little business with the US, you can do a little business with China and Russia. This is called complementarity. This is what Central Asia is known for, some of the Caucasus countries. And it's something that I would say Ukraine should have adopted rather than pick one side, just conduct mutually beneficial, equal relations with both sides of the balance of the great power, balance. And I think that's a good way to survive. I think that some of the Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan serve as a model for states that are stuck in a really bad way. And so I think for my understanding of weak states is there's a lot of freedom because no one's aiming your nuclear weapons at you. Great powers are aiming their nukes against each other. So you don't have to worry as much as a weak state. It's just, how are you going to take advantage of the situation?
Yeah, when one final comment and question is, in a lot of your work, you talk about case studies and you analyze history and you utilize different cases. Can you talk a little about what methodologies you use to publish your books? And also theoretically, do you kind of use a particular theory based on what questions you want to answer in terms of your research agenda and questions?
Yes. Well, my primary methodology is um, theory building. So I like the theories very much that exist, but I'm sometimes not satisfied with their limitations. And so what I do is I tweak an assumption, I change an assumption, or I get rid of it completely and replace it with another very different assumption. And in that way, I can have more, I guess, fun and flexibility with a particular interest, a phenomenon that I would like to explain, understand, or even try to predict what's going to happen next. And so that's um, my primary methodology. I use case studies and historical case studies to sort of explain how the theory would work in order to prepare for usually what's a conclusions chapter, the prediction aspect of it, where I have more flexibility. And I don't just have one prediction, I have like maybe three predictions of or alternatives. So in my globalization and multipolarity book, I argue that the United States has basically three options to amend its relationship with China. One is do nothing differently and allow for the rise of China. The second one is war, which would be absolutely terrible. But the third option is decoupling and containment. So stop investing in China, pull out your investments, and try to contain them. Try to encourage other countries to do the same. That way you can get rid of a major threat. And so using theory building, one has a lot of ability to ask these grand questions in order to better understand, I think, what everybody wants to know. I think a lot of theories and a lot of international relations and work today has gone it's gone very micro and very sometimes very boring. And so I kind of like to spice things up by asking these maybe sometimes a controversial question of what should we do about A, B, or C. And so that's my primary methodology.
Yeah, I'd encourage everyone to read Dr. Kassab's very eclectic work, right? A lot of eclectic interests. Any final things that we missed? Any final concluding thoughts that you want to add for our audience, Hannah?
You should always let your curiosity drive your scholarship. I sometimes you're faced with a lot of opposition to what you want to study. And I think the most important thing is to take that step of knowing what you want to do and being able to defend it in a way that you can survive scrutiny. If you can't survive the scrutiny, then you have to, I guess, give up. But I encourage everyone to, if you know, ask those big questions and be curious and don't be afraid to step on a couple of toes here and there, because that's what we do in academia.
Well, thank you so much, Hannah, for talking with us. We really appreciate it. It's been fascinating. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.